International, and of course last year here at the Court with the Friday Night Sex. But tonight, possibly the most relevant, as she will explain, is something called the Girlfriend Experience, which she also worked on. Beyond her, Professor Lynne Segal of Birkbeck, an anniversary professor there. She's written widely on feminist theory and politics, femininity, masculinity and sexuality, as well as memory and ageing. And Peter Tatchell, of course, is the prominent campaigner and activist for human rights, democracy, LGBT freedom and global justice, and is also now the Green Party's spokesperson on human rights. The session, as you know, is sparked by Abby Morgan's play on this stage, The Mistress Contract, with Saskia Reeves and Danny Webb, playing in a very skillfully worked through version a real-life American couple who are now 88 and 93, but who 30 years ago signed a contract that he would provide her with a home and income in return for mistress services, all sexual acts as requested, with suspension of historical, emotional and psychological disclaimers. And they would tape their conversations so as to throw light on gender politics. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but they do rather end up arguing about who waters the plants, which is rather more familiar to some of us. It's also worth mentioning that Abby, the author of this play, was also screenwriter for The Invisible Woman, based on Claire Tomalin's book about Dickens and his young mistress, who didn't get to negotiate very much, this being the 1800s. So power and contracts and money and sexual agreements, and the topic is, should we contract our sex lives? At a time when marriage is changing in many ways, including gay marriage, this is a really interesting topic. And we're going to ask each of the panellists to sort of set out a case. It might be a case, it might be an argument, it might be an observation for a few minutes, and then later on we shall open it very much up to the floor. So, Alecky, I thought you might like to start.
Okay. Yes, I make verbatim plays, and the play that we referred to, The Girlfriend Experience, which I think is sort of the most relevant to this evening, was a piece I created from hours of interviews that I carried out in a daytime seaside brothel, and edited those conversations. They were collected over about 18 months. And I was sort of following really to see whether the women there could find relationships outside work. One of them was married, but the rest of them were single and were actually hoping, not with clients, but to sort of see if they could find relationships. And so I think that the things that I sort of observed, which are most relevant for this evening, were they talked a lot about how many of the punters that they saw were married men. And from how they saw it, I didn't talk to the men, so I don't know their side of it, but in terms of the working girls, they felt that they were actually keeping a lot of those marriages on track because they were performing services that maybe the partners didn't want to do. So they were sort of relieving attention, keeping everything sort of bubbling along on the sex life side of things, so that the husband and wife could just continue their sort of normal marriage. And they really kind of thought that they were, performing a service in that way. In terms of their own relationships, they had a golden rule, which was never go out with a punter. That was the golden rule, and that was something that was the kind of one thing that they said they all stuck to. And over the course of my time there, one of them did break it, and that's sort of where it did all start to go pear-shaped, because relationships become, emotions become involved, and it's no longer just a financial contract. And that's when things got messy and they went wrong. So I would say very much in terms of the experience I've had, on that side of working, with those women, the contract was very important, and when it wasn't adhered to, that's when things went wrong and broke down.
So the Pretty Woman plot absolutely didn't work for them? That was pure fantasy?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Sophie Day.
Thank you. I've seen the play and I won't give the plot away, but one of the things I really enjoyed about it was the contract as a narrative device, which entangled our ideas about different contracts, in this case prostitution and marriage so thoroughly that you thought they were just one. And they are, of course, equally contracts, different kinds of contracts, different lengths of time, different sorts of exchanges. But the point that comes across is a little similar to what Alecky is saying. One of them is that sometimes contracts protect the position of the more vulnerable person. And in contracts between men and women, you often think of women as being disadvantaged by contracts, but this story is saying, well, the contract's upfront what you get, and it's also what you don't get. So it's a limited contract, unlike love, which is always unlimited. So that's quite provoking. And then there's another whole side to the contract that comes out because it's gone over by a lawyer and is therefore presumably enforceable. But with many of these contracts, when you say I do in a marriage, it's not so much the legal side and what can be enforced at that very moment. It's more in the nature of a promise or a commitment or an intention. And that's what it does in this play. It's a sort of fairy tale romance that comes out from this intention without either of them in a position to know at the beginning what might happen in the future. So, thinking about this in terms of should we contract our sex lives, I don't know whether we should, but we all do. And the way I would like to think about that is the way a lot of feminists writing at the time this play took place in the 1980s argued that the sort of notion we have of a social contract from long ago, you know, instead of men fighting each other, they decided to give up part of their freedom for the greater good. What these feminists wrote about in the 1980s was, well, there was a kind of spurious universalism, and the people who got to make that contract were only certain kinds of people called men, because they owned themselves and they could dispose of themselves as they liked. But the social contract was built on a sexual contract, which meant that women couldn't join the public sphere but could be kept along with children safely at home, where they made the whole social contract possible. To give a very, very condensed version of an imaginary contract, if you like, which is thought to be what made us come from a brutal world of nature where we were all fighting into a civilized world such as 17th century England. The feminists of the 1980s, such as Carol Pateman, said that that social contract was always and also a sexual contract. And it was a sexual contract which wasn't really about sex, it was about gender between men and women. And that's kind of what the play is speaking to, and that's probably enough to say.
So the marriage contract is a social contract which actually does protect women from being dragged off by their hair by cavemen.
You know, if we were talking, well, Hobbes didn't really know that women existed, but if we were reading Hobbes from Carol Pateman's point of view, yes.
Right, Lynne Segal.
Well, I do have a different position, which just shows how diverse feminism has always been. And I don't like giving simple yes-no answers to complex matters, but if a gun were held at my head as to whether we should have sexual contracts, then I would have to say the answer I would give is no, and I'll elaborate on that. I feel in a funny position because I don't want to spoil the play for all those who are about to see it. So let me say it's very well acted, and also the question of intimacy and relationships and engagement between women and men, this is a couple on stage the whole time, is always, of course, intensely interesting. But to me, it felt not at all really informed by the second wave feminism that I knew in the 1970s. It's set in 1981, so this is just the end period of the peak of women's liberation. And women's liberation, of course, flows in with the words of Simone de Beauvoir saying, we're not the second sex, we're not the inferior sex, we're not put here to service and titillate men. So the last thing, it seems to me, that we then would have thought was acceptable was a sexual contract saying that men could do whatever they like with our bodies, particularly as we know that what a significant minority of men like to do is to be violent and coercive, and strangely this doesn't come up in the play, which which is slightly odd because it became such an issue at precisely that time, and she's meant to be reading Dawkins and so on, so the idea that it's okay to say a man can do anything he likes with her body is somewhat surprising. And the whole point of second wave feminism then was to dispute the perception of women as nothing other than their bodies and their sexuality. You know, that had to be changed. And somehow this isn't a factor in the play, and the woman feels that she can become more independent and work out how to enjoy life and perhaps even how to love this man by allowing him free access to her body, so long as she has a sort of financial independence. Now, she is already a teacher, so she's not someone who has no other resources, but she wants this extra resource to feel more equal to her partner, who is a rich man. And I would say that this is an extraordinarily odd sort of contract to make, because what men who pay for women's sexuality have always wanted is a woman to be young, to be slim, and to be what is coded as beautiful. So for this to be a lifetime arrangement to bring about greater equality seems to me remarkably odd. Now, she objects to the sex that she's having with this man, which seems to be primarily fellatio, and that seems to make her feel like a sexual object and to feel inferior. But somehow she's happy to continue with this and thinks that this will improve things. But I simply find that odd and so different from the sexual politics of the 1970s, where, you know, we certainly wanted to be able to explore our own bodies, to work out how to have the sorts of sexual relationships we wanted. Those who did feel demeaned in sex with men usually became political lesbians. They didn't get contracts with men, as I say, particularly when they didn't have to. So I would never say it is in all circumstances wrong for a woman to have a sexual contract, to be paid for sex, basically, because who knows, you know, what the situation of the woman is. But to present this as something that would empower women and make them feel more equal with men feels utterly unconvincing to me. I mean, there are many ways in which women can bond with each other, bond with men, and it would seem that the last thing we need to be doing in making life a better place for men and women, particularly men and women who want to be together, would be to increase the commodification of our bodies and of our sexuality, when we don't have to.
I think what
I just want to finally say, because if we are to lead full and creative lives, surely we want the full pleasures and risks of love and everything else in life, rather than to be working on contracts.
Well, I was just going to say the thing in the play, the original real contract, was this wonderful phrase, all sexual acts as requested, with suspension of historical, emotional and psychological disclaimers. Who are they? Robots. Whether they can or cannot disclaim those, you will find out when you see the play. Peter Tatchell, I suspect we may be able to move now away from the heterosexual gender politics we've been talking about. In your views?
Not entirely.
Not all the way.
For me, the starting point is that we already have a contract. It's called marriage or a civil partnership. Those are the existing forms of contract. What this play deals with people who are outside those kind of formal state-recognised structures. What I like to say is that if we were starting from scratch, I don't think we'd invent marriage as it is. Looking at the patriarchal history of marriage, looking at it as an instrument of male control over women and for the inheritance of property through the male line, which is how it originally began, I don't think we'd start from that kind of premise. And the way I see civil partnerships are that they are, in essence, marriage light. They're marriage by a different name, with essentially the same rights and the same responsibilities, based on the same template as marriage. What I'd like to suggest is that there ought to be a new option. Perhaps not abolish marriage or civil partnerships, but a new option which was more democratic and flexible and adaptable to the many diverse lifestyles that people live in modern Western societies. So I proposed the idea of what I've called a civil commitment pact, you call it another name if you wish, whereby anyone could nominate a person in their life as their significant other, and they could designate them as their next of kin and their beneficiary in the event of their death. So they'd be free of inheritance taxes, like a person in a civil partnership or a civil marriage or religious marriage. The idea is to get away from the privileging of people in those traditional models of relationship contract. But when it comes to people in a love relationship, I'd go one step further. I would say that they should have a special contract, but they should be able to draw it up by picking and mixing from a menu of rights and responsibilities to make a partnership agreement suited to their particular circumstances. So as we know, marriage and civil partnership, it's one size fits all. This is it, what it stands for, this is what you sign up to, there's no negotiation. Under my system, people could pick a mix from a menu of rights and responsibilities. So as we know, some people live together, others live apart. Some maintain financial independence, others share their finances. Some have children, others don't, and so on. There's lots of different ways in which people have relationships, and lots of different ways in which they want recognition and contracts for those relationships. So under this system, each couple could devise a tailor-made partnership agreement suited to their particular individual circumstances. And I think the moreover the benefit of this would be that it actually forced people to think more thoughtfully about what they were getting into, because the couple would together have to negotiate each of those different rights and responsibilities and tick the box or sign the box. Whereas with marriage and civil partnership, you just sign the thing and that's it. So I think it might encourage people to be a bit more prudent and cautious and careful about what they get into. But that's just an idea to think about what might be beyond marriage and civil partnership.
The world is slightly moving that way, in that the French have a thing called a pax, where you can name this significant other. It could be a brother or sister you want to do it. And also, of course, prenups are now being heavily discussed. But I wonder, could we all talk together a bit about the business of sex workers and their rights? Because we began with that, with Alecky. And I mean, this is very relevant, gay or straight. A lot of young men become involved and ensnared in this, as well as young women now. I mean, what are your feelings about, is it right that such brief short-term contracts should be constantly traded, or is it damaging to individuals? And who do you criminalise? Because the government is now talking about criminalising the punters and possibly decriminalising the workers. Where are you on that, Peter?
I think it's a really difficult issue. I think we know for certain that the vast majority of women in the sex industry are not there by free choice. There's a lot of trafficking, pimping, and even enslavement. And that quite clearly is wrong. But we also know that a minority of women, and indeed men, work in the sex industry by their own free will and choice. And I don't know both men and women who are now mature adults in their 50s and 60s who did sex work years and years ago. It got them through university, got them into a good job, enabled them to care, in the case of one woman I know, to care for her children to a standard which she never otherwise would have been possible. She looks back and says, it probably wouldn't have been her first choice, but she didn't feel she was being abused or exploited. She felt that she got something out of that. She doesn't look back with regret. Now I agree, that is probably a minority female perspective. When it comes to gay male escorts, I think the situation is quite different. I think there's a much greater level of involvement, enjoyment, and non-coercion and non-trafficking. I'm not saying there isn't any, there is probably some, but it's very, very, very small. And the amount of violent pornography in gay porn is relatively small.
It's smaller, is it, than
Yes.
than straight? Yes.
And, for the purposes of this program, I looked at some porn the other night online, just for academic purposes. And the one thing that struck me was, all the partners were, of a similar age. They quite clearly seem to be enjoying it. I mean, you can tell if someone's faking it. There are a couple of instances where it wasn't quite clear whether the guy was in pleasure or pain, but in most instances, you could get the vibe that they were really into it and really enjoying it and getting real sort of sexual satisfaction. Now, of course, that is not the same in many instances of heterosexual pornography. And I think we have to make those nuanced differences.
There's the presumption that the male is stronger than the female. So if you have two males, one hopes the presumption is that if you don't like it, you punch him. I don't know.
Let's come in on that, because it's I've worked with sex work, mostly women's sex workers, for a long time, over a period in which it became a largely UK and Commonwealth-based industry in London to a largely migrant industry. In fact, the first wave of migrants were relatively well, experienced, educated, older, and did much better than the previous generation. But throughout, whether they were locals or non-locals, the problem was whether they had documentation. And the problem wasn't the contract, it was the inability to enforce the contract. So if somebody broke the contract, you go to the police or the court or the magistrate or your employer and say, hang on a minute, where's my sick pay? So we have to be a little bit careful when we're talking about contracts to say who's making the contract and who's sustaining it. Because trafficking is 99% men in this country. I mean, it's exactly parallel to the idea of white slaving in the 19th century, when women for the first time could travel without their husband on their own passport and were said to be either abandoning their nation or polluting where they'd gone to. And there was this huge anxiety about reproductive matter being in the wrong place. So it's not really about sex as labour, which many sex workers say, if I choose to work with sex rather than with my hands or my brain, who are you to tell me it's inalienable and I can't? That's not their problem. The problem is really that it is criminalised, so you can't make a contract that sticks.
Lynne, can you see sex as labour and as legitimate labour?
Well, I wanted to say that I did agree with much that Peter said, except for this fact that I'm not only a feminist, but I'm this Diluvian thing, also a socialist. And the idea that people have to use sex work in order to get through university or to do to achieve other ends, which I think should be available to all, is something I find very problematic. And I feel that the greater acceptance of anything is possible in order to earn money, anything is marketable, is extremely dangerous in these neoliberal times, because I think it's the case that soon, welfare will be disappearing altogether.
But we want to then focus on the welfare, not blaming the poor.
I'm not talking about blaming the poor.
No.
I'm talking about the dangers of imagining that we can easily commodify our sexuality as anything else, and then certainly young people, why not go whoring in order to pay for their education? And I think that is extremely worrying, the idea that this is perfectly acceptable.
Alecky, you, when you were talking to all these girls and the girlfriend experience, the interesting thing was you, of course, you were a young woman yourself and pretty and attractive, all the rest of it. Did you sense that it was really okay for them?
Well, that's partly why I sort of stayed there for so long, because I couldn't believe that this wasn't causing them some harm in some kind of way. So when I first went there, they were, very upbeat. It was quite interesting. It was sort of like a cooperative. So there was no pimp, there was no madam. Somebody was in charge, but she was also one of the working girls. And she'd, been on the game for years and years, and all these women had worked in various other establishments and were sick of giving a cut of their earnings to the madam or the pimp. So they'd set up their own business together. And I met them sort of at the beginning of this journey. So they were all very positive, and we're doing it for ourselves, and we're empowered. And I sort of thought, really, surely after a while this must affect you, because what you're doing is going in there and selling your body for sex. Does that not? Surely the cracks must start to show. And indeed they did. Even the ones who were very good at putting on this kind of alter ego, hence taking on the other name, and sort of literally the door would go and you'd see them sort of put on their fluffy mules, and they'd sort of put on this act and they would become this other person. That was the way they could sort of get through it. But after months and months, there was a sort of a breakdown, if you like, and the woman who was in charge just had to kind of shut up shop because she just couldn't cope. And I think that's probably quite a common cycle.
Well, because you are editing out tenderness, the possibility of tenderness from something which with most of us, I think, gay and straight, tenderness is massively important, isn't it? You know, it's sort of that, you know,
Yes,
as well as just genital goings on.
Yeah, and these women, they were all mature ladies. They weren't trafficked. They were British. They were if you like, they sort of thought that yes, they kind of were in control, and they could offer maybe what some of the maybe the younger, more glamorous girls couldn't offer, which was conversation and cuddles as well, because
so they were
English.
starting to market the cup of tea and the kind word.
That's
as well.
right. So they were selling a personality as well as sex, and I think that's where the damage started, because that's when you're actually letting somebody in more on just a
in
physical.
half.
Exactly.
Yes. And Peter, you were rather implying that you think that young men on the game don't have to split quite so much, or don't seem to have to sort of split themselves quite. They say this is fun. It's fun for me, fun for him. Hell with it.
I'd say that's more the case with gay porn than straight porn, but I wouldn't say it's always the case. But in looking at those videos the other night, I mean, I was struck by how many of them had a sort of romantic narrative, and you know, the sweet talking thing. Some didn't. Some were just very, very down and basic, but some of them did have, you know, what appeared to be, you know, they were probably acting, but it came across as something tender, and in the course of the sex, you know, in quite a few of the videos, there was a lot of tenderness. And I don't think that could be faked. I think, you know, obviously people probably knew each other and were doing this. But again, it's not about justifying it.
Well,
I would draw the line at criminal.
What about the real, on the real street? You know, I mean, it seems to me there are some young men, sometimes very young men, being massively abused by older men. But do you think that is therefore an exact parallel with the young girls being abused by older men?
Yes, I mean, there obviously is abuse of young boys as with young girls. That's undoubtedly true. I mean, I was going to say that where I draw the line is not, I'm not approving of this. I'm not saying I'm an advocate of it. What I am saying, I doubt that criminalisation is the appropriate response. And I think, you know, various attempts like New Zealand to decriminalise sex work, I think is probably the way to go. Perhaps we can improve on the New Zealand model, but I think that's generally an advance on what we've got now.
And of course, Alecky, your context is illegal in the UK law. They
That's
could all
right.
be done.
That's
and
right.
locked up. So any way in which you work, it happens to be with sex, but in that form of work, you can't employ anyone, you can't give money to anyone, you can't manage anyone, you can't work with anyone else. So it's not the contract the woman's making, it's the wider social contract saying, yeah, well, if you really want to be a sex worker, you can do it if you do it on your own, if you don't share your money with anyone, if you don't advertise, which makes you very vulnerable.
Which makes you very, exactly. So the women in the brothel were much safer because they were there was, three of them at any one time, which is much better than one being in the flat on her own.
Right, let's see what the floor would like to raise. Yes, one down there. There's some microphones around. We'll go there and then we'll go to that one over there next.
Can any conclusions that
Yes, sorry.
can any conclusions that are being reached this evening be taken seriously by the wider society when the male patriarchy itself isn't being represented on the stage? For example, was Fraser Nelson invited, or?
You say that the male
James.
patriarchy is not being represented here on the stage. I think it's Peter Tatchell, frankly.
I must say it's nice to be the token man. It's usually reversed.
Yes, it's difficult to say. I mean, the thing is that the male patriarch, I suppose, does not tend to be a sex worker or tend to have to contract anything. He can make his contract with his woman or with his man, but far more likely with his woman, that type of man, they can make their contract.
It does relate, though, to something that came up when you said, would it be right to go down the Swedish route where you decriminalise the sex worker, which has happened in New Zealand apparently, but you criminalise the punter. Whereas in fact, then, the sex worker can't actually make a living if you criminalise the punter, and you're almost certainly going to make her working conditions less safe, so that it is an issue. What are we saying about men and men?
It may be worth thinking of the relationship between a client and a sex worker as well, because I have worked with clients too, and on the whole, the feeling in the sex industry in London that I know is that clients are far more fragile, easily controlled men in sex work than they are outside, because there's this notion of vulnerability for the man as well. It's somewhat stigmatized. They don't know if they're going to be robbed or made fun of, or what role is being acted out. They don't know if they can make a relationship. Many clients go to see the same woman many times, and in fact a lot of them do end up, not a lot, there's a proportion that end up in some long-term relationship. And it's a limited contract, unlike many others.
Someone down there has a microphone, I think, had a hand up earlier. Yes, lady there. I've been told to describe you, it seems so rude. Incredibly glamorous.
It's okay, I'm a lady, it's good, it's a good description. Alecky, you actually used the phrase, like, you know, people being in the game very casually, and that's just how we sort of refer to prostitution quite a lot. But what I was wondering is what you think is sort of like, whose game is it, and who wins, and why is it still a game? And maybe that's the problem, is that people do see it like that.
I think that's
not quite a question, but there's a question nearly there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the language that they would, you know, say themselves. You know, yep, we're on the game, and that they could say that because I think they were happy with it and they owned it. No one was forcing them to do it, unlike women who were trafficked or girls who were doing it because they've got drug habits or whatever. These is quite this kind of niche group that Peter was talking about in terms of, you know, not being controlled by anybody else. So they sort of were more comfortable with it, so they could be freer with their language.
I think Lynne might have a point. I mean, I have to say, I find it quite easy to say things like turning tricks or on the game, because that sort of seems like a kind of neutral thing to say. But as an old-fashioned type person, I'm representing the patriarchy here, please note, old-fashioned. Think of me as a bishop, if you would. I find sex work a really difficult expression, and I find the idea of services, providing services, kind of difficult. I don't know, Lynne.
Well, I think as a career route, it's unlikely to be the best one a woman could be following. I mean, not only is she likely to become much more vulnerable to violence and so on, but as I've said, it is only when young and slim and reasonably, conforming reasonably to beauty standards, that she will be able to make her living in a good way, in this way. And you don't find, on the whole, people who have more choices, who have more resources, choosing to become sex workers. And so, you know, to me it does relate to the obscene inequality in society overall, that this is the choice that's being made by certain women and certain young men. And so while, again, I'm not for condemning it as such, I'm for questioning a society where this is the choice that people feel they have to make.
I know it's a minority.
On the floor, microphones to two
Yes,
people
absolutely.
there, and then we'll go back to there. Yes.
But I just want to say on that, on the terms of like empowering, there was you know, a woman at this particular brothel where I was working who felt that because she was being paid for sex, it made her feel more wanted and attractive than in her everyday life, where maybe men wouldn't give her a second glance, and she really believed that.
Can I just add on? I remember going to Thailand to do some interviews with sex workers in the 80s, particularly around the emerging HIV epidemic there. And it was mostly with young gay men. And I challenged them about, why are you doing this sex work, And the response was always the same. It's better than working in a rice paddy field or in a sweatshop. I'm paying not only for have a nice apartment for myself, I'm paying for my whole family and extended family. But don't you feel bad about that? And they said, why should I feel bad about it? Your point is, of course people shouldn't have these limited options. In an ideal world, we should be striving for a society where everybody has real meaningful choices and doesn't have to resort to this. But in situations where that isn't the case, I was really struck by the real sincere conviction that these young guys, 18, 19, 20, really felt that they had made a choice, the best choice in the circumstances for themselves, and very importantly for their families.
And sometimes if they knew you well, they'd say, I'd rather be doing what I'm doing than what you're doing.
I want to go round the floor a bit, point to point. First of all, gentleman there, yes.
Okay, it's a very important discussion talking about sex work and prostitution and pornography. I haven't seen the play, but I understand it's about a relationship between two people and how that works out in alternative relationships, and not just everyone conforming to exclusive monogamy, and what options there might be for open relationships or polyamorous relationships, and to look at those sort of unspoken or unwritten contracts that people have in all sorts of relationships outside of sex work and outside of pornography. So I'd be more interested to hear some views more along those lines.
I should say that in the play, they're a very leery adult couple who both know what they want and say it firmly. But actually what Peter was saying, let's just come back very quickly to what Peter was saying, you were saying you wanted almost people to think through a menu of options of what kind of marriage or liaison or connection they'll have, which of course a lot of us do. It's not formal. We still do, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, but you kind of know that you both want children.
Can I just say something?
I'm going to stay at work. Yeah.
In response to that last question, because you see, to me it's an incredibly conventional play. It could have been a 19th century play written by George Bernard Shaw, or even earlier, She Stoops to Conquer Goldsworthy. And so in the play, of course, it's the man who, they both have their freedom, but it's the man who has lots of relationships and wants lots of sex, and it's the woman who doesn't even enjoy sex and certainly isn't presented as having sexual relationships and is waiting for this man to get in touch with her and come back from his other relationships to her. So I don't think polyamory is really what is on issue here. It is something much more conventional, and the writing about what men want and what women want, and the women keep saying we have different ideas of intimacy, and they are sure as hell conventional.
Some marriages exist on a very similar model, don't they? The old your dear father who never bothered me much model of marriage, and the I don't want children or
but that wasn't a feminist idea, was it?
No. Yes, down. Where are the microphones? There was somebody else over there. Let's have one over there. Let's go point to point. There, and then there, and then there. Right?
Thank you. I'm a teacher, and I'm just wondering, a secondary school teacher, and I'm wondering what you would suggest that we teach in PSHE in order to enable children to make the more advanced choices that you are suggesting. I have to say that government guidelines aren't with you on this one.
Right. Okay, that's a good point. We'll come to that in a moment. Yes, down here there were a couple of voices I haven't heard. One there and one there. Let's do one after the other and then we'll pick up the points.
I just wanted your thoughts really on the representation of sex workers in the media. We get these awful images about young girls in sex trafficking. I'm not sure what the adjective is there. And then the glamorous image of Belle de Jour in Secret Diary of a Call Girl, and how we're meant to feel about those two conflicting images.
Thanks. And then just past this lady in the front here, we'll take that point, and then those two fit rather well together.
The contract works because although it's completely illegal and utterly unenforceable in any court in this country, I don't know about California, they want it to work. So it's a relationship based on what they want. I know she has sex when she doesn't feel like it, but she's agreed to it and she's sticking to what she's agreed to. but it isn't an enforceable contract.
Good point about the play. Now, those two other points do sort of go together. What do we teach in PHSE? What do we tell the kids? And how are sex workers represented in the media? Because you have this very glamorous end and you have this very sort of squalid end. Who'd like to pick up on those points? How do we transmit a civilised social model of how sex could work?
Well, I would go back to where I started and say we are all enmeshed in contracts whether we choose to be or not, and they structure a lot to do with the relationships between men and women, and I think it's a really helpful point to bring up without necessarily talking about trafficking, that this woman in the play is an older, white, West Coast woman. And since, over the period, it's about 30 years, isn't it?
Yes.
Over the period of that play, that figure in the West Coast has come to be supported by an increasingly large cast of poorer and less white and further travelling other women. And as with including sex work, a lot of work that poorly paid people do, they do their public work, if you like, in other people's homes as cleaners or nannies or whatever else. And so all their skills, or however they do their job, doesn't go to reflect back on them, but on the status of their employer. So if you're teaching sex education in school, I think it's worth thinking about the category of a woman and a man as a very large category where, there can be more distance, as there is now, between different kinds of women than between the two figures in the play.
Well, to answer all three questions, what do we tell our young people? Well, certainly I think we'd have to not encourage them to see this play, actually, because they wouldn't get much of an idea of the possibility of women's sexuality. I mean, women's sexuality as something which can be joyful and liberating, and so long as they feel that they are in control of it, that they are able to able to try to set the terms of what they want. I don't think this is ever easy. I think that sex and desire always involves perils, and I also agree that the idea that the contract would protect you is totally silly. There's no protection, and anyone who is selling sex is going to be least protected of all. So we get back to how we think about women's sexual agency and how we can make women feel that they are desirable as young women without necessarily having to conform to whatever a man wants of them. I think that it's a very, very hard thing. And as for sex workers in the media, well, I think that it's diabolical, of course, because either sex workers are murdered, which they usually are, that's the standard plot, the sex worker would be murdered, or sometimes they're totally romanticised as enjoying it. So the idea of the contract sex worker we have here is clearly not something.
I would put my hand up here for the soaps. I would say that in Coronation Street there was a rather brilliant thing where one girl did go, did become a call girl for a period, and this still hangs over her, and the whole kind of sort of middle and lower middle England really still holds this over her, and it's disapproved of. I think that was quite a realistic portrayal. Peter, can I come to you on this? What do we teach the children, and how do we portray sexual contracts in media?
Well, I think the purpose of the education system is to prepare young people for adult life. And as we all know, sex and relationships are a very important part of being an adult. For most of us, the person we love and have sex with is the most important person in our life. Yet schools do so little to encourage what I call sexual literacy. Sex and relationship education in our schools is woefully poor. I go to schools quite regularly and speak, and time again people say, we're not getting the facts. It's all about reproduction, and often in other species. It's not about relationships, it's not about emotions. Astonishingly, despite people's rightful concern about child sex abuse, there's no teaching in hardly any school about abuse issues. The right to say no, how you say no, what you do if someone pesters you for sex. It's not good just saying phone childline. You've got to give young people the knowledge and skills to assert confidently their right to say no, to give them the sense They don't have to give in to pressure. And I think, when we come to sex and relationship education, we also need to teach much more about issues like pornography, so that young people don't have unrealistic expectations, and so they don't think that every relationship they're going to have is with a person who can come 16 times a night. The reality is very different, and I think we need to apprise young people of that, so that people can deal with pornography, which they're going to see whether we like it or not. I'm not approving of it. I don't approve of early sex, but if these things happen, we need to have young people with the knowledge, skills and confidence to make wise, responsible choices, and that includes saying no to sex they don't want.
I think the best primary school headmaster speech I ever heard he was older primary, just other people's bodies are not toys. And I said to him afterwards, and are you going to add to that, and they shouldn't be for sale either? And he said, I'm not going into that because of all the politics of it. Right, floor. Who else? Yes, somebody in the middle there. Is there
Can I just add that the reason why I made a play set in this particular brothel was because I felt that in the media, whoever asked that question, you have Belle de Jour and you have girls who.
And you wanted to reflect the middle.
That's why they talked to me, because they said we are not as small and niche as you think, and there's a lot of women like us who are actually doing this.
Indeed. Yes, so someone in the centre there. Any other hands? Yes. Well, there first, and then we'll come down here, and then the back. So there. We're in one order. Yes.
Libby, sorry.
Yeah?
I think we only have time for 2 more questions. So
two more questions.
2 and then.
Right. Well, I was thinking if there weren't any answers, if we just let the floor
say
their thing. I am watching the clock. So okay, let's just say what is it you want to say, all you people? You there in the centre first with the microphone.
I'm the teacher's sister, but I'm not going to ask about that. What I'd like to ask the panel about is a spectacular breach of a contract and its potential power today, which is Lysistrata and withholding of sexual favours in order to prevent a war. Could that be used today? Is that putting women in control?
Right, the Lysistrata option. Can we have one word? Do you think this is a good option we should be all trying?
I don't think it will work. I think
Even
we
if
have
you're
very
married to
little
a
control
minister for
over
war.
them going to war at all, even when 2 million of us go to the streets pretending they still do it. So.
There's a great new teenage identity, but I can't remember quite what they call it. It's a North American one about being an out celibate.
I think they should give it a go.
They should give it a go, right? Okay. Where were the other microphones?
Back. She was waiting.
Yeah, one at the back. Yes. Can we get one at the back? Sorry about this. I can't see as well as I
I'm
should.
supposed to make a statement or a question, but I'll just make a statement. I think one of the issues that we have in this society, and I'm talking in this modern day British society, and it applies perhaps both to civil unions as indeed it does to marriage, and it's the big issue that nobody really wants to address, and that is whether or not actually as human beings, despite our kind of heraldic view of romantic love, and there being some one person out there for us, that realistically as sexual beings we are perhaps not monogamous.
Okay, let's have a little bit of a
Can I just recommend, there's a book came out a few years ago called The Myth of Monogamy, which was a fantastic, brilliant book, which drew on studies of various animal species that were supposedly monogamous, which showed that in fact, in reality, they weren't monogamous at all, because it traced through the DNA from
vampire bats are.
Huh?
I read a book the other day, vampire bats are.
But then it also looked at culturally human society, and so I think, monogamy is something you can strive for, but it probably isn't in our DNA.
Can I say this is a young person's question, because over 60% of older women find they have no partners at all. They're living alone because of the skewing in straight sex of older men desiring younger women, particularly post-menopause. So multiple relationships for older women is something which is so far from the agenda.
How many people here feel that they either are monogamous, wish to be monogamous, think everyone should be monogamous? How many dedicated monogamists? Not a lot. Yes. And how many think Peter?
You should be so we're lucky.
How many are really anti-monogamy and think it's a lousy idea? Right, okay, well, you're debating afterwards. One more. We have one more point from the floor, please. Yes, down there.
Assuming we can contract our sex lives, how do we contract our emotions? What do we do when someone changes their mind?
So we contract our sex lives and it changes. Yeah, we're back to tenderness, aren't we? Back to humans.
I think it's absolutely true that for most of us, sex and emotions and feelings go together. So to separate those is really difficult for most people. And I think that, you know, one of the good things about, you know, a successful relationship is that there's that combination of the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, you know, a whole cross spectrum makes a relationship, not any one thing. And at the risk of sounding too confessional, a lot of people I speak to say that as their relationships get older and longer, they lose their sexual interest. With me, it's the exact opposite. The longer the relationship goes on, because of the emotional bond and tenderness, the stronger the sexual desire.
I think the problem is surely that sex is not any one thing. Those of you who have read Foucault will know that he said that so many things are condensed into sexuality. You know, often people engage in sex for the hope of intimacy, for the hope of closeness and to be seen as an important person in someone else's eyes. Some men may engage in sex precisely to confirm their masculinity, and that's the main thing. But there are so many ways that sex can be significant in our lives that it makes it hard to answer in a simple way what sex can and can't do. It's always a little perilous. And the more desire is involved, the more perilous it's likely to be.
Never take the danger out of it. Both agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to contract your emotions.
Well, we have come to the end of our time. Thanks to Alecky Blythe, Sophie, Lynne Segal and Peter Tatchell.